Do you have too many tomatoes in your garden? Or a better question is, do you have too many green tomatoes in your garden? It's the end of the growing season here in the Northeast United States, so what to do with all the green tomatoes in the garden? One answer is to ferment them. Fermenting vegetables is a process that has been used for thousands of years to preserve the harvest. The process is simple. You need a container. I use glass mason jars. This one is 64 ounces. I've replaced the metal lids that are used for canning with these plastic ones. The metal eventually rusts, the plastic doesn't. Next, you will need salt that is not iodized. Use sea salt. It contains beneficial trace minerals in addition to the sodium. I use this Himalayan pink salt. Sometimes I use this Celtic salt, and sometimes this Red Sea salt. Lately, I've been liking the flavor of the Celtic salt better than the other two. We did a blind taste test with family members, and they all agreed that the Himalayan salt came in third for taste. So experiment with different salts. They don't all taste the same. Just make sure the salt is not iodized. The iodine can inhibit the fermentation process. Okay, so we have a glass jar and salt. Now we need water. Use non-chlorinated water. The chlorine in the water can also inhibit the fermentation process. Tap water here in the United States is usually chlorinated unless you have your own well. So use filtered water or bottled water. You can also boil the water for 20 minutes. The heat and aeration from boiling the water will dissipate most of the chlorine. Now that we have the glass jar, the water, and the salt, we need the vegetables and any spices we might want to use. This video is on fermenting green tomatoes, so here we have green tomatoes. For extra flavor, I'm adding some garlic. I used a whole head of garlic for this 64-ounce jar. I also added dill, a nice big bunch of dill, and 2 jalapeno peppers. I should have used more. And then a heaping tablespoon of pickling spice. This pickling spice has lots of goodies in it. Pieces of chili pepper, bay leaves, as well as dill seeds, coriander, and mustard seeds. These spices are all optional, so feel free to omit any of these spices or experiment with your own blend. Try basil instead of dill, or use habaneros instead of jalapenos. It's fun to experiment and try new variations. You can even just ferment the tomatoes in saltwater solution without additional spices, although I like adding more flavor. It's your choice. But the salt, the water, and of course the tomatoes are necessary. The rest is optional to your taste preferences. Once you have all the ingredients lined up, cut the tomatoes into bite-sized wedges, or if they are cherry tomatoes, cut them in half. Otherwise, the salt solution will have a hard time permeating the skin of the tomatoes. Now put all the dry ingredients in the glass jar. I like putting the dill at the bottom, middle, and then top. The rest of the ingredients I spread around the jar. The dill at the top acts like a cap for the rest of the ingredients. Now it's time to mix up the salt solution. The scientific way to do this is to create a 2.5% salt solution. To do this correctly, you need to measure your vegetables and water and add 2.5 grams of salt to every 100 grams of produce. Now, I know that's the best way to do this, but I found the lazy way works well for me, and that lazy way, or non-scientific way, is to measure out 2 tablespoons of salt into a quart of water. The general rule of people using this less scientific method is to measure out between 1 to 3 tablespoons per quart, so I've settled on 2 tablespoons. The idea is to have enough salt in the water to keep the unwanted bacteria from propagating. The salt also helps to keep the vegetables crisp and crunchy. So measure out 4 cups of water, that's 32 ounces, and add 2 tablespoons of salt, mix, and done. Then pour the salt solution over the veggies, in this case the green tomatoes, dill, garlic, and jalapeno peppers. Now here comes a rule that cannot be broken. Make sure all the vegetables are completely submerged in the saltwater solution. To do this, you'll need something to weigh them down so that they all stay under the water. None of the vegetables should be poking up out of the water. There are a variety of ways to do this. In a previous video I did on fermenting pickled curry cauliflower, I used the plastic baggie method. You can check out that video to see how that works, but here I'm using these glass weights. They're made specifically for wide mouth mason jars. Just drop the glass weight on top of the tomatoes and it pushes everything down under the water. Now put a cap on to keep out the dust and other unwelcome guests. Don't screw the cap on too tightly. As the fermentation process happens, CO2 is released. See these bubbles? That's the carbon dioxide escaping. I put my glass jar in a tray to catch any spillover. Now cover the jar and let the tomatoes ferment in a place where the temperature is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure it's not much lower than 68 degrees and not much higher than 72 degrees. So 70 degrees is a good mid-range temperature. The reason we cover the jar is to keep out the light. The lactic acid bacteria is what causes the fermentation process, and the light kills this bacteria. A common question asked is, how do we know when the fermented vegetables are ready? The fermentation process is a continual process, and the taste of the vegetables change over time as the microorganisms keep working. The fermentation process will take at least 1 or 2 weeks. You can test the pH levels of your ferments with pH strips. The fermented foods need to have a pH of 4.6 or lower to be acidic enough to be considered safe. Under 4.0 is probably better. The longer you let the vegetables ferment, the more flavorful they will be. I let these tomatoes ferment for a little more than 2 weeks, tasting it every couple of days after the first week. You will see the color of the tomatoes start to turn lighter and lighter to almost translucent. Also smell the ferment. It should smell pickly, not spoiled. Play around with this recipe and have fun experimenting with your own variations. I hope you enjoyed this video on fermenting green tomatoes. If you did, check out my other videos and please subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. Bye.